On June 13th, 1944, the first V-1 flying bomb was launched against the city of London. In the first V-1 bombing campaign, as many as 100 V-1s an hour were falling on the city, and in the first 80 days, as many as 6,000 people were killed and 17,000 were injured. In the following September, the Germans would unleash an even more terrifying weapon in the V-2, a ballistic missile that flew so high and so fast that it could not be intercepted by anti-aircraft weapons. It was the rocket that launched the space age. Over the next decades, rockets and missiles would come to dominate military technology and create a unique and surprising threat to Mexico. The U.S. missiles that blundered across our southern border during the Cold War are history that deserves to be remembered. On May 2nd, 1945, a man in Austria walked up to a private of the U.S. 44th Infantry Division and said, in broken English, "My name is Magnus von Braun. My brother invented the V-2. We want to surrender." In that moment, the U.S. has captured one of the most sought-after of the German scientists over whom the East and West were competing in the waning stages of the Second World War. Along with Werner von Braun, the Americans captured the plans to the V-2 rocket and over 300 train car loads of spare V-2 parts. These parts would become the core of a program to develop and test U.S. missiles, both for military use and eventually to support the manned space program, officially becoming part of the Hermes project, which was started in 1944 in response to German rocket attacks in Europe. To support the project, the Army developed a missile launching site within what was then called the White Sands Proving Ground, the military testing area that had been the site of the test of the world's first atomic bomb, Trinity, in July 1945. The missile launch site, first called Army Launch Area No. 1 and then Launch Complex 33, would be the location where captured V-2 rockets would be fired as sounding rockets, or rockets for scientific tests, as well as to develop new U.S. rockets. The Department of the Interior noted the historical significance of the site when it nominated Complex 33 for the National Register of Historic Places in 1985. The site test-fired 67 V-2 rockets between 1946 and 1951, the first major rocket firings conducted in the United States. The V-2 was the first vehicle to carry scientific instruments into the upper atmosphere and the first large rocket with a liquid propellant motor. The V-2 provided the technological base upon which the United States would build to develop the Saturn family of rockets that eventually carried Americans to the moon and beyond. The project had several goals, according to the program's final report. First, it had gained experience in handling and firing large missiles and trained Army personnel to launch them. Second, Hermes had provided vehicles for experiments which aided the design of future missiles. Third, Hermes had tested components for future missiles. Fourth, Hermes had obtained ballistic data on high-altitude trajectories, as well as developing various means of tracking such trajectories. Fifth, the V-2 program had provided vehicles for upper atmosphere and biological research. But the project would continue to the development of new missiles, notably Hermes missiles. The Hermes missiles were an attempt to create a ramjet-powered supersonic cruise missile. These missiles would use a V-2 engine to accelerate the rocket to a speed and altitude where the ramjets would then start. The rocket was sometimes described as the world's first multi-stage rocket, with the upper stage including a broad wing for flight tests of a split-wing ducted airfoil ramjet, although no active ramjet was yet included. The missile was 51.5 feet tall, had a gross weight of 31,750 pounds, and the liquid oxygen alcohol-fueled engine produced 60,000 pounds of thrust. The first test of what they had labeled the Hermes 2 was on May 29th, 1947, and it went the wrong direction. The website This Day in Aviation explained in 2020. The plan was for the rocket to arc towards the north, heading for the far end of the proving grounds. Instead, the Hermes 2 arched to the south. The rocket peaked at 35 nautical miles, passed over Fort Bliss in El Paso, and after about 5 minutes of flight, hit the ground about 1.5 miles from the Buena Vista Airport in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. According to the New York Daily News on May 31st, an experiment with push-button warfare sent a modified German V-2 rocket soaring over El Paso and Juarez at a speed of 12 miles a minute and scared the daylights out of residents of both cities. According to the El Paso Times, the rocket exploded on top of a rocky knoll 3.5 miles south of the Juarez business district and scooped out a crater 50 feet wide. While no one was killed by the rocket, the news noted that the explosion started a panic in the Mexican city and jarred windows out of the central fire station in El Paso. Women knelt in the streets of Juarez to pray. Window panes were shattered. Plaster was dislodged in homes. Some thought an atom bomb had hit. The news noted that the United States was quick to apologize to Mexico for bombing our southern neighbor with a Nazi terror weapon, and in fact managed to blame the Germans, claiming it was a defective German gyroscope that sent the missile south instead of north. While the U.S. Army reportedly paid for the damaged windows and the State Department expressed its official regrets for bombing Mexico, the accident gained surprisingly little further attention. It was possibly the first, but not the last, missile that would stray across the border. On October 11th of the same year, there was an explosion in the Xanalayuca Mountains, about 35 miles south of Juarez. The Mexican military identified the explosion as coming from a V-2, although officials at White Sands denied that there had been any launches. The V-2 and the Hermes were the genesis of both the United States military rocket program and its manned space program, but as the strategic situation changed, new rocket systems were developed. According to the defense contractor Lockheed Martin, the MGM-31 missile was developed as a reaction to the Soviet intervention following the Hungarian uprising of 1956. The Lockheed Martin webpage explains, in 1957, NATO officials, fearing further Soviet aggression into the heart of Europe, decided to act swiftly. Should any member of NATO be attacked, they declared, the United States would be forced to respond with a large-scale nuclear strike. But to enforce the strategy, U.S. officials needed an imposing weapon on the ground in West Germany. Something to make the Soviets think twice about any attempts to expand the Iron Curtain westward. That weapon would be a two-stage, solid-fueled ballistic missile named after General of the Army John J. Pershing. The 10,275-pound, 34.6-foot missile had an operational range of 460 miles and could be equipped with a W-50 nuclear warhead with a yield of up to 400 kilotons. Built to be a shoot-and-scoot weapon on a mobile transporter erector launcher, the missile was equipped by both U.S. Army and West German Air Force troops, and units were first stationed in West Germany in 1964. But there was a problem with the missiles stationed in Europe, as there was no range in Europe large enough for troops to practice launching the weapon. Thus, both American and West German troops would come to the United States for routine training and practice. The weapon's range was too large to test on the White Sands Missile Range, and so sites were developed to allow troops to launch missiles that would then land at White Sands. Among the locations used was the Black Mesa Test Range, a place where the Cannoner, the Post newspaper of Fort Sill, Oklahoma, said, "The dust gives the whole area an ash-rose hue, that, together with an expanse of clear blue sky and snow-topped Colorado mountains in the hazy distance, makes the mesa look like a landscape painting by Frederick Remington." The paper went on to explain, what makes the mesa perfect for Pershing firing is its geographical location. It lies almost 400 miles north of the White Sands Missile Range. And so it was, in September 1967, U.S. and West German troops came to the Black Mesa Test Facility to fire Pershing missiles, fortunately without nuclear warheads, at New Mexico, when, according to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, an out-of-control Army Pershing missile landed in an uninhabited region of Mexico. Ryan Eddington, a visiting assistant professor of history at Macalester College, explained in his 2014 book, Range Wars. A Pershing missile broke into pieces in the wooded Bosque Bonito, about 140 miles southeast of Juarez, not far from the Texas-Mexico border. According to the New York Times, a West German unit had successfully fired a Pershing missile early in the day, but when the American unit fired a missile, the 10,000-pound Pershing missile went off course and landed in Mexico. Edgington says that an Army civilian expert later suggested a short circuit most likely caused an electronic failure in the rocket. The Times reported that no property damage or injuries were reported, and the Mexican government gave the United States government permission to send a helicopter across the border to look for the missile. Finding the parts of the missile was not easy. Edgington mentions that Felipe Chavez Garcia, a laborer on the Puerto Alto Ranch, recalled that in the early morning hours of September 12th, a loud explosion, followed by two other loud noises, had startled him from his bed. The impact crater measured 13 feet in diameter and nearly 5 feet deep. It took 12 days of searching to find the missile's most significant parts. Despite the risk, had the debris landed over a population center, Edgington explained, in all, the incident ended with little fanfare. The lack of significant evidence of impact on the Mexican landscape or harm to local communities may have hindered protests from government officials or the local populace. UFO researcher No Torres concluded in his 2008 book, Mexico's Roswell, the Mexican government was none too happy to have U.S. military hardware raining down upon its northwestern territories, but diplomats quickly resolved the dispute. It was not lost on people at the time that the missile was named after General John J. Pershing, who in 1916 had famously led an army across the American-Mexico border chasing Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa. The Albuquerque Journal, noting the 1947 event, quipped, "Every 20 years, the United States sends a missile over Mexico." but it wouldn't take 20 years for it to happen again. As the Cold War developed, the U.S. became more and more concerned with a perceived missile gap, and planners obsessed over Soviet nuclear capabilities. One solution to keep the American strategic edge was to research re-entry systems, and in 1963 the U.S. established a military joint service program for re-entry vehicle research, development, and testing called the Advanced Ballistic Re-entry System Project, or ABRIS. But testing re-entry systems was complex. Not only was it incredibly expensive to fire and test full-size rockets like the Atlas or Titan, but such tests generally had to occur over the ocean, making them easier for enemies to observe. One solution was to do scaled tests with a smaller rocket that could be produced more cheaply and tested at White Sands. But the Air Force needed a launch site some distance from White Sands in order to make the test flights at re-entry velocities. The Department of Defense finally chose a site near the tiny town of Green River, Utah, as the location where test launches towards New Mexico would cause the least inconvenience. The test vehicle would be a 4-stage, 50-foot, 8-ton, solid-fueled missile called the Athena, which could simulate the speeds and re-entry phenomena of the larger intercontinental ballistic missiles, carrying a payload of 50 pounds at a re-entry velocity of approximately 23,000 feet per second. The Las Cruces Sun-News noted that the Athena was dubbed the flying trash pile because it was created cheaply by combining parts of existing missile systems. A January 1964 issue of the Salt Lake Tribune noted that the rocket would make the approximately 470-mile trip between Green River and White Sands in just 9 minutes, while reaching altitudes of up to 200 miles. However, the missile was not without its problems. As the Sun News noted, the first 2 firings of the missile in 1964 went astray. Pieces of the first launch were found near the New Mexico-Colorado border after it misfired shortly after launch. The second missile was destroyed in flight, and parts of it landed on a Navajo reservation near Shiprock, New Mexico. The problem was of enough concern that a February 12, 1964 issue of the New York Times noted that Utah Senator Wallace F. Bennett asked for a halt in the program. But by 1969, the program had recovered, and a July 1969 edition of the Las Vegas Optic headlined White Sands Proud of Athena Missile quoted Program CEO Air Force Colonel L.R. Sugarman. "I think the Athena program has over-succeeded for an off-the-shelf type of program of putting parts together for a missile, bragging that Athena has pushed the state-of-the-art we have been getting here on the range. The program had attained such a level of success that a larger version called Athena H was in the works." But the missile's record took a hit when on July 11, 1970, an American missile launch again went across the border. A memorandum, just released in 2015, from the National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger to the President read, "At 5 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time today, an Athena rocket test fired from Green River, Utah, overshot its target at White Sands, New Mexico, and impacted 180 to 200 miles south of the Mexican border." The Philadelphia Inquirer noted the next day that an Air Force Athena missile programmed to impact on the New Mexico desert testing ground went astray early Saturday and probably crashed in a remote section of Mexico. As with the previous missile crashes, the U.S. had to seek Mexican permission to search for the missile, as noted in a July 13th issue of the Baltimore Sun. At the time, the Sun reported there were no explosives or classified material on the missile. However, it later came out that the missile was carrying a small amount of the radioisotope cobalt-57. But the Air Force said that the risk was small. The official line was that it was not dangerous to human or animal life, so long as it was not ingested or handled. However, the inclusion of radioactive material created a new tension between the nations, not apparently felt in the previous incidents. As Eddington explained in Range Wars, conflict and confusion surrounded reports. Moreover, Air Force promises about its safety assumed the material had stayed within its protective tungsten sleeve. The debris proved difficult to find and was in the end only identified using a special Atomic Energy Commission plane called ARMS, or Aerial Radiological Measuring System, which had sensitive materials for identifying radiological contamination. While the system did locate the radioactive material, it also determined that the material had dispersed and was no longer in its protective sleeve. While the risks from the tiny amount of material were not clear, concerns by the government of Mexico required that the U.S. send a team to remove the material. The Orlando Sentinel reported on September 24th. The Army said that contamination at the site represented no hazard, but the Army said the Mexican government has requested that the soil be returned to its natural condition. A 40-man team was required to build a road into the remote area and remove the contaminated soil in steel drums. The website Redacted explains, "The cleanup effort was long, costly, and included the construction of a road through the Mapami Desert to excavate hundreds of tons of soil from the impacted site. One of the unintended impacts of these cross-border missile mishaps is that the entire remote area of northwestern Mexico that was affected has developed a reputation for paranormal activity, including both UFO sightings and a supposed dead zone where compasses and electronic instruments won't work, much like the Bermuda Triangle. While there are some anecdotal stories, this zone supposedly moves around, and so the so-called Map-A-Me dead zone is proven untestable by scientific means. Many experts believe that this reputation for paranormal activity is nothing more than speculation and confusion that came as a result of the missile accidents. The Athena missile testing program was briefly stopped in 1970 following the July accident, but it was restarted again in January of 1971. Both the Black Mesa and the Green River sites are now abandoned, and there are several reports online of people who have gone and visited these ransacked and rotting Cold War facilities. In the end, maybe because the area is simply so remote, or maybe because of blind luck, none of these missile mishaps killed anyone, and they actually did very little damage, although they did stress U.S.-Mexican relations. And to be fair, the vast majority of the missiles that were fired at White Sands ended their career there. But, as the website Redacted notes, the fact that this testing continued despite multiple testing failures and a reduced budget and the looming possibility of an international incident shows just how central nuclear arms parity was to U.S. foreign policy by the beginning of the 1970s. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.